The market square in the Grey Reach was never a place for mercy. It was a place for exchange, for deals, for casting off excess and taking what was necessary. The air here was always thick with the stench of cheap tobacco, wet wool, and that specific bitterness that lingers on the tongue when you stand too long where people lose their dignity. Kaiden Rivers had been standing at the edge of the square for a solid hour. He wasn't looking for anything special. A couple of sturdy tools for the forge, maybe a supply of strong hemp rope, and a sack of salt to survive the winter in his shack on the mountain slope. He was a man accustomed to predictability. His life consisted of cycles: chopping wood, working with iron, keeping the fire alive, sleeping. It was a life without frills, but with a clear understanding that every morning he woke up in a house where no one expected words from him that he didn't want to say. And then he heard a sound. It wasn't a scream, not a cry. Orcs don't cry where humans can hear them. It was the sound of a blow, heavy, hollow, with the distinct crunch of bone against frozen ground. Kaiden was no hero. He wasn't the type to rush at every sound to save the world, but he was a blacksmith. He knew the sound of breaking iron and the sound of a breaking living body, and the difference between them was fundamental to him. He turned around. In the center of the square, in a circle that people avoided with cautious respect, stood a man in Baron Morgan's livery, a type with eyes reflecting nothing but greed, wielding a whip whose tip was wrapped in metallic wire. On her knees, hands clasped behind her head, was an orc woman. She was massive. Even bent double, she dominated the space. Her skin, the color of deep moss, was covered in streaks of dirt and dried blood, but there was no submission in the way she held her head. She stared straight ahead into the void, with that same absent expression Kaiden had seen in animals that realized their fate no longer belonged to them. She was sold, put up for auction like a thing, like defective goods. The merchant yanked her by the chain attached to a massive iron collar, and she swayed but stood her ground. There was no fear in her eyes. There was silence, a cold, deep silence that Kaiden would recognize out of 1,000 others. It was the silence of a person who had already buried their tomorrow. "Starting price, 10 gold pieces," the merchant roared, savoring every sound. "For heavy labor, for the mines, for any purpose. Take her before she drops dead." Kaiden took a step forward. He hadn't planned this. His hand moved on its own to his belt, where a heavy pouch held his savings from the last 6 months. This was money for new bellows for the forge, for a new anvil, for things that were supposed to guarantee him a quiet winter without the need to descend into the city. He looked at her. The orc woman slowly turned her head. Her eyes, amber like frozen resin, met his gaze. There was no hope in them. There was only the indifferent expectation of the next blow. Kaiden Rivers was a man who had built walls around himself his entire life. He didn't want to let anyone into his life, especially an orc, a representative of a race with which his people waged an endless, pointless war. But something in the way she clenched her fingers, trying to stop the trembling from the cold, and how she endured this humiliating inspection, resonated within him with something unpleasant. It was a feeling he couldn't ignore. Responsibility. The very thing he had tried so hard to burn out of himself when he left for the mountains. 12, he said. His voice sounded foreign, dry as the crackle of dead wood. The merchant narrowed his eyes. Someone in the crowd laughed.
12? For this mountain of meat? She won't last a week if you don't drive her with a whip. 15.
Kaiden felt something clench inside him. It wasn't the desire to possess. It was the desire to stop it.
To stop this spectacle, to stop the sound of the blow, to stop watching how something created to be strong was turned to dust under the heels of nobodies. 20, he cut in. And you give me the chain, now. The square fell silent. The merchant, deciding this was the limit, grimaced but nodded. Kaiden walked up, threw the coins, and took the chain. The iron was ice cold. The orc woman rose. She stood up to her full height, and Kaiden had to tilt his head back to meet her gaze. She was almost a head taller than him, massive, with shoulders that could move a boulder. She looked at him, at the human who had bought her. Something flashed in her eyes that he couldn't decipher. Was it bewilderment or disdain? "Walk," he said, without looking back. She walked, heavily, dragging her feet, but with a dignity that forced the people around them to involuntarily step back. Kaiden led her across the square, feeling hundreds of stares on him. He knew he was doing something foolish. He knew that in an hour the tavern would be discussing how the hermit Rivers had gone mad and gotten himself a tame beast. He knew that bringing an orc woman to his home meant bringing trouble upon himself, the likes of which he hadn't seen in all his 7 years of solitude. He walked, and she followed him without asking questions. She didn't try to escape, though she knew he wouldn't hold her. She didn't ask for help, although her wounds had begun to bleed. She just walked, like a shadow, like a part of his new, irreversibly changed reality. They passed through the city gates, and the road to the mountains opened up ahead. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of an approaching snowfall. Kaiden looked at his purchase.
She was alive. She was dangerous. She was a riddle he didn't want the answer to. But she was here. And now, by the laws of the mountains, he was responsible for her, whether he wanted to be or not. "It's a 3-hour walk to the house," he said, tossing her a piece of his cloak. "If you fall, I won't carry you." She threw the cloak over herself, wrapping it around her broad shoulders. "I won't fall," she replied. Her voice sounded like the strike of steel against an anvil. This was the first time they spoke, and Kaiden realized that these were not the last words they would have to say to each other. He turned around and walked faster, trying to deceive himself, trying to convince himself that this was just business, just another deal. Just a man and his orc woman bought for 20 coins. But deep down, he already knew. The home they were returning to would never be the same. The silence he had so carefully guarded for 7 years had been broken, and what he feared to name aloud had begun. The beginning of the end of his solitude. The road home wasn't just a physical path. It was a filtration process. Every step along the rocky trail, every gust of wind tearing off the snow-capped ridges, served as a kind of test for both of them. Kaiden walked ahead, keeping to the familiar pace he had developed over the years. Step, breath, shift of weight. He didn't look back, but he felt every movement of the orc woman behind his back as a physical presence, almost like a change in air pressure. She stepped exactly in his tracks, and it was strange. Usually, creatures bought at the market either tried to lag behind, hoping for a chance to escape into the brush, or they scurried, afraid of not keeping up with their master. But she walked with the grace of a predator studying the territory it had been placed in. When the roof of his shack came into view, Kaiden felt a sting of doubt for the first time in these hours. His home was the fortress of his alienation. There was no place here for foreign footprints, foreign scents, foreign presence. Every object in this shack was in its place because he had put it there himself. Every tool in the workshop was polished to a shine because it was his responsibility. Now all of this, his cozy,
meticulously calculated loneliness, was supposed to collapse under the weight of this massive, silent figure that had come from another world. "Stay here," he threw over his shoulder, opening the door. He went in first, quickly striking flint, blowing on the smoldering coals in the hearth. The flames greedily attacked the dry kindling, and within a minute the room began to fill with thick, living warmth. Kaiden took his time inviting her inside. He walked to the table, poured a mug of water, and downed it in one gulp, feeling something heavy stirring inside him. It was the feeling of losing control. He had built his entire life to exclude random occurrences, and today he himself had bought the biggest random occurrence one could imagine in that market. He opened the door wider. The orc woman stood on the threshold, covered in snow, her hands clasped together in front of her. She resembled a statue carved from stone in the harshest season. "Come in. The spot in the corner with the cot, that is yours now. If you want to eat, there's bread in the cupboard, water in the barrel. Don't touch the tools in the workshop unless you want to lose your fingers. And don't ask why I did what I did." She stepped over the threshold silently. Her huge figure seemed absurd in the cramped room meant for one. She carefully looked around, as if scanning the space for threats, comfort, and hidden rules. Kaiden watched her, eyes narrowed. He expected her to start looking around, maybe show fear or disappointment at the poverty of his dwelling. But she merely nodded, accepting the terms. "I am not asking," she answered quietly. Her voice, despite the exhaustion, sounded like a taut string. "You bought me to work.
Tell me what needs to be done, and I will do it. I don't need unnecessary words, and neither do you." She began to undress, and Kaiden briefly looked away, feeling a strange awkwardness. She took off the rough coat, remaining in a simple linen shirt soaked in sweat and dirt. On her shoulders, he saw old scars, long, deep gashes left most likely by a whip or some branding tool. These marks on her skin told a story he didn't want to know, but which he saw all too clearly. She walked to the indicated corner, dropped her modest bag, and sat on the floor, leaning her back against a log. The evening passed in a tension you could cut with a knife. Kaiden sat at the table to finish sketching the design for arrowheads, but his pencil wouldn't obey. He felt her gaze on his back. It wasn't curiosity, it was analysis. She was watching how he moved, how he breathed, how he was nervous. He felt that she saw right through him, and it made him want to grit his teeth. "Why aren't you in the mines?" she asked suddenly. Kaiden froze. He slowly turned around, resting his elbows on the table. His face was habitually impassive, but a shadow of irritation flickered in his eyes. "That is none of your business." "It matters," she continued calmly, looking into the fire. "Someone who keeps a house like this and has tools like these is not just a farmer. You are a blacksmith, but there are no orders in this house. You are hiding just like I am. We are both here because we have nowhere else to go." "We are here," he interrupted, emphasizing every word, "because I paid 20 gold pieces. And as long as you are here, you will do your job. The rest is none of your concern." She didn't argue. She only slightly bowed her head, as if accepting his anger as a given. Kaiden stood up, took the lamp, and walked past her to his bed behind the partition. He knew he wouldn't sleep. He would lie in the darkness, listening to her every exhale, wondering if she had slit his throat while he was turned away. The night passed in a strange, almost tangible silence. The house groaned from the frost, but Kaiden heard only her breathing. It was deep, measured, devoid of anxiety. How could she sleep so peacefully in the house of a stranger who had bought her like a thing? This question gave him no rest.
Morning began even before the sun rose. Kaiden woke up to an unfamiliar sound. Someone was rattling a bucket. He quickly jumped up, threw on his jacket, and walked into the main room. She was already dressed, her hair braided into a tight, neat plait. She had managed to fetch water from the well and chop wood while he slept. The hearth was blazing, and the room was filled with the aroma. He sniffed. It wasn't the smell of burnt porridge. It was the smell of an herbal decoction that he had gathered himself last summer, but never used. "I found this in the pantry," she said without turning around. "You sleep poorly. These herbs help lift the weight from the chest. In the mountains, we call them spirit's solace." Kaiden froze, watching how deftly she managed his kitchen. She hadn't asked for permission. She simply entered his daily life and began organizing it as if it were her own. This provoked a mixture of fury and something else within him. Gratitude? No, that was too loud a word. It was more like astonishment. "I didn't ask you to cook," he said, approaching the table. "I can't just sit around," she replied, placing a bowl in front of him. "Work is what keeps me conscious. As long as I work, I don't feel the pit they threw me into. You should try eating this." He looked at the bowl. The decoction was clear, golden, smelling of mountain slopes and freedom. He picked up the spoon. The taste was clean, slightly bitter, but brought a strange relief. He finished eating, feeling the ice that had bound him since morning begin to thaw inside. "After breakfast, we head to the forge," he said, wiping his mouth. "There is an order that needs to be finished by evening."
I need you to hold the tongs. If you flinch even once, I'll throw you out the door."
"I won't flinch," she replied.
It was cold in the forge, but the work quickly heated the air. Kaiden pumped the bellows, and orange sparks flew to the ceiling. He took a billet of steel, glowing white-hot, and placed it on the anvil. She took the tongs. Her grip was iron. She held the heavy block of steel with such ease as if it were a feather. He struck with the hammer, feeling the rhythm they picked up from the very first seconds. It was a dance. Strike, turn, strike again. She felt his every movement, anticipating where he would strike next. An hour flew by unnoticed. When the last strike faded and the steel went into the water, the forge filled with hissing and a cloud of steam. Kaiden wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at her. Her face was covered in soot, her forehead glistened with exertion, but in her eyes burned that very same fire he had seen only in the old masters. "Where did you learn?" he asked, struggling to control his voice. "My father was the best blacksmith in our clan," she said, setting the tongs aside. "He taught me that steel is a living creature. You can't break it. You have to negotiate with it. You were too harsh with it today. That's why it cracked on the edge." Kaiden looked at the arrowhead. There was a barely noticeable hairline crack. He had missed it. He, a master with 10 years of experience, hadn't noticed the defect that she saw a second before the strike. He looked at her with a long, evaluating gaze. She wasn't bragging. She was simply stating a fact. "You're right," he said after a long silence. "Too harsh." "Steel forgives a lot," she added, stepping away to the window. "But it does not forgive mistakes based on anger." Kaiden felt the walls of his house, which he had so carefully built, start to close in. She was here. She was smarter, stronger, and, what was most terrifying, she understood him. She saw his mistakes, saw his pain, saw his fear. And yet she didn't try to strike back. She was simply present. "Go," he said, pointing to the door. "That's enough for today. Go fetch water before it gets dark." She left, and Kaiden remained standing in the semi-darkness of the forge, listening to the steel cool down. He knew that this day was a turning point. He had bought her to save her, but now it seemed to him that he was the one who needed saving, and she was the only person who could give it. But he wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for his life to stop being his own. He wasn't ready for a voice to appear in his house that would challenge his decisions, and hands that would help him forge his destiny. In the evening, when the house sank back into silence, he sat by the window, watching the moon illuminate the snow-capped peaks. She sat in her corner, mending something, and he felt her presence as warmth radiating from a living being. "Why didn't you leave?" he suddenly asked, not turning around. "You could have left when we were on the trail. I didn't hold you on a chain." She raised her head, and in the lamplight her eyes glinted with a strange light. "And where would I go, Kaiden Rivers? Into that emptiness you pulled me out of? Here, at least, there is a fire. And here is a man who, albeit with hatred, saved me. To me, that is more than I've seen in the last 3 years." She leaned over her sewing again. "And besides," she added in a whisper that he barely caught, "you are the first one who looked at me not as merchandise, but as someone who can hold the tongs." Kaiden closed his eyes. Those words hit him harder than any hammer. He was the one who saved her, but he was also the one who now bore the burden of her trust. And trust is the heaviest load you can place on the shoulders of a man who has run from closeness his whole life. He stood up, walked over to her, and without saying a word, placed a small piece of fur on the table, which he had been saving to line his boots. "It will be colder tonight," he said, turning away. "Take this for the bed." She looked at the fur, then at him. "Thank you," she said. It was the first thank you he had heard in this house in 7 years. It sounded simple, without a shadow of obsequiousness, just a fact of gratitude. He returned to his room, lay down in bed, and for the first time in a long time, fell asleep almost immediately. And in his sleep, he saw no fires, no roar of battle, no screams of the dying, but the strike of a hammer against an anvil, and 2 silhouettes, brown and green, working together in a harmony that was impossible, but which was the only reality left to them. The house slept. The valley sighed. 2 people in this house were bound by a contract bought for 20 gold pieces, but behind that thin paper hid something more. Something had begun that over time could become either their salvation or their ruin. But for now, as long as the fire burned and they were warm, that was enough. Days in the valley began to acquire a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. It was like the turning of millstones, heavy, slow, with a constant background hum that eventually stopped being annoying and became a part of life itself. Kaiden woke up when the sky beyond the pass was just starting to turn gray, and the first thing, even before his feet touched the floor, he heard movement in the kitchen. She always woke up earlier. It was an unspoken competition they never discussed, but which defined the order of their existence. Dra, that was what he began to call her to himself, although the name hadn't slipped from his lips aloud yet. In a week, became a natural part of the landscape, like the old oak at the gate or the scree on the northern slope. She rearranged the utensils in the cupboards so that everything was now close at hand, and he caught himself thinking that he would never have come up with such logic of spatial organization. She cleaned the hearth with an almost religious thoroughness, as if scrubbing out not just the ash, but something that had accumulated in this house over his years of loneliness. In the forge, they began to work as a single mechanism. Kaiden no longer explained what needed to be done. She knew. She knew when to add air to the bellows, when it was time to change the grip, and when the steel sang just the way the master needed. It was an intimacy that frightened him more than any combat. In battle, you know where the enemy is and where you are. In the forge, when you work as a pair, the boundaries between I and you blur. And in those moments, when sparks rained down on the floor and their movements merged into a single rhythm, Kaiden felt his control slipping away. "You're pressing too hard on the right edge," she said one day, as they were forging a decorative grating for a client from the city. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the glowing metal. "Leave a little more weight on your left hand. The metal itself will lay down the way you want." Kaiden frowned, shifted his grip on the hammer, and struck. The grating obediently bent into the perfect shape he hadn't been able to achieve for the last 3 hours. He lowered the hammer and wiped his face with a dirty rag. "Where did you learn to work with artistic casting?" he asked, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. "In the mountain clans, they only forge weapons, tools, swords, arrowheads. Artistic forging is the domain of court masters." She froze for a moment. Her hand, gripping the tongs, trembled. It was a barely noticeable movement, but to Kaiden, it was equivalent to a scream. She slowly laid the tongs on the table. "Everyone has a past they prefer to burn," she said, looking toward the door beyond which the snow-covered wasteland began. "You aren't just here for no reason either, Kaiden. People don't go to the mountains to take up farming if they don't have a reason they're afraid to name aloud." "Did I answer your question?" he asked sharply. "You answered a question with a question. That's an honest answer for a man who hides his name, but not for one who claims to be the master of this house." She turned and walked out. He heard her heavy footsteps echoing on the porch. She went to chop wood. He stood in the middle of the forge, feeling a strange irritation boiling within him, mixed with a burning curiosity. Who was she? He had bought her as a slave, but every day he realized he had bought a mirror. She reflected his own closed-off nature, his own pain, his own unwillingness to admit that life requires the involvement of other people. That evening, he discovered that she had sorted through all the books on the shelf. She had stacked them, wiped away the dust, and the very book of poetry he had hidden behind other volumes now lay on top. She hadn't read it, he could tell by the way the bookmark lay, but she knew it was there. "Poetry is an attempt to tell the truth when ordinary words fall short," she said, standing by the window and watching the fading day. "My mother loved to listen to the old clan sing songs. They weren't poems, but the rhythm was similar. The rhythm of survival." Kaiden walked to the table, poured himself some ale, and sat down. "I don't want to talk about the past, Dreya. It's dead. We are here. We are alive. We have a roof and work. Isn't that enough?" She turned to him. In her eyes, usually cold and calm, flickered a spark of something inexpressibly sad. "Enough for the body, but not enough for what lives inside. You think if you lock the door with all the bolts, you can cheat time? You are still waiting, Kaiden." "You are waiting for someone to knock on this door, and you fear it more than death." His hand gripped the mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. She was right. She was always right. And that made her presence in his life unbearable. He wanted to hate her, wanted to see her again merely as labor bought for 20 coins. But she wouldn't let him. She was a person, complex, multifaceted, full of contradictions. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The knock was sharp, uncertain, unlike the knock of a traveler who knows how to ask for lodging. Kaiden and Dreya exchanged a look. He stood up instantly, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the cleaver hanging by the hearth. In such weather, at such a time of day, no one rode into the mountains. "Stay here," he whispered. He walked to the door and threw it open. On the threshold stood young Elias Grogan. He looked terrible, his face pale, his clothes torn, his hands shaking. He held a bloody bundle wrapped in rough cloth. "Kaiden," he rasped, almost collapsing onto the threshold. They told me you are the only one who can help. My father, he was attacked. On the pass." Dreya was at the door in a second. She pushed Kaiden aside, caught the boy under his arms, and dragged him into the house. "Lay him on the table," she commanded, her voice instantly changing. It was the voice of a warrior, the voice of someone used to giving orders in a critical situation. "Kaiden, water. Hot water and clean rags. Move!" Kaiden obeyed without even realizing what he was doing. He saw Dreya unroll the bundle. It wasn't a bundle. It was Elias's jacket, soaked in blood. The boy's father was down below, on the road. His horse had run away, and the attackers, they weren't just robbing. "These weren't bandits," Elias exhaled, looking at Dreya, who had already begun washing the wounds on his side. "They had brands. The ones they talk about in the legends. Morgan's brands." Kaiden froze. Morgan, the man who was the overlord of the markets, the slave trader, the very one he had bought Dreya from. Kaiden looked at her. She didn't flinch. Her fingers moved quickly, confidently. She was stitching the wound on the boy's side with such professional precision that any regimental healer would envy. "They are looking for someone," she said, without looking up. "They are not looking for gold. They are looking for someone who escaped." Kaiden looked at her. She knew. She had known from the very first day. She knew why she was put up for auction. She knew who was behind it. And she knew that sooner or later they would come for her here, to his house. "Who are you, Dreya?" he asked, feeling the world around him begin to crumble. She looked up at him. There was no longer indifference in her gaze. There was fury, cold and sharp as a blade. "I am the reason you are now on a hit list too, Kaiden Rivers. But if you let me work, I promise, this house will become their grave." Outside, from the forest, a howl carried over. But it wasn't a wolf. It was the sound of a hunting horn, low, vibrating, chilling to the bone. The hunt had begun. Kaiden looked at his reflection in the window. He was a blacksmith, a farmer, a man who just wanted to live out his days in silence. But now, looking at the orc woman who was saving the life of a man he barely knew, he realized there would be no more silence. Now there would only be steel, fire, and the choice that would define who he would die as. He walked over to the wall, pressed a hidden lever behind the bookshelf, and a piece of masonry gave way inward. Behind it opened a hidden cache, the existence of which he hadn't known himself. He had discovered it by accident in his first year living here, but had never opened it. There weren't tools inside. There were swords. Old, heavy, covered in engravings he couldn't read. "My father left this to me," he said, drawing one of the blades. "I thought it was just scrap metal, but now I see what it is." Dreya looked at the sword, and her eyes widened. "These are the blades of the House of the Blood Moon," she whispered. "Kaiden, who is your father?" "I don't know,"
he answered honestly, feeling fear for the first time over who he truly was. But it seems it's time to find out. He tossed the sword to her. She caught it in midair, and in her hands it came alive. She swung it, and the air whistled. This was no weapon for a farmer. This was a weapon for someone about to turn this world upside down. "We have an hour," she said, returning to Elias to finish bandaging him. "Kaiden, close all the windows. Light the lanterns in the yard. Let them think we are waiting for them with open arms." Kaiden looked at her, at his bought orc woman, at his partner, at his secret. He realized that his life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to both of them. He walked out onto the threshold. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky cleared, revealing cold, indifferent stars. In the forest, the lights of torches ignited. There were many of them, too many for one blacksmith and one orc woman. But in Kaiden's chest, for the first time in 7 years, a heartbeat, not measured and dull, but with that frantic speed that only happens to someone who knows. He has finally found something worth not just existing for, but burning for. He grabbed a lantern, walked out to the middle of the yard, and raised it high above his head. "Come!" he shouted into the emptiness of the forest. "Come if you want to get what you came for!" The echo rolled through the valley, making the trees shudder. The forest answered with silence. The hunters were approaching, but it wasn't a farmer waiting for them in this house. A man was waiting, who had finally remembered that a blacksmith forges not only iron. He forges will. And if necessary, he will forge his own dawn out of this night. "Kaiden," she called from inside the house. He turned around.
She stood in the doorway, holding the sword in both hands. The soot from the forge was mixed with blood, but she looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Are you ready?" she asked. He looked at his hands, calloused, dirty, accustomed to hard labor, and then at the sword. "I have been ready for this my entire life," he replied. "I just didn't know it." They entered the house and closed the door. The bolt clanked like a gunshot. Now they were alone against the whole world. But in this house, in this silence, there was something that made them stronger than all of Morgan's armies. It was the truth. And tonight, they were going to turn that truth into iron and blood. He didn't know if they would survive until morning. He didn't know who he was, or why his father had left him these swords. He only knew one thing. Dreya was by his side, and that was the only fact that mattered. He winked at her, and for the first time ever, she smiled. Just barely, with the corner of her lips. But it was a smile that said more than any words. They were ready. The sound didn't come first. The sensation did. The air in the house suddenly grew heavy, almost tangible, the way it is before a thunderstorm, when the atmospheric pressure drops and it feels like you're breathing cotton. Kaiden pressed his back against the wall next to the door. He felt a chill radiating from the doorway, although there was almost no wind outside. It was the chill of the foreign presence. Professionals do not make noise. They don't break fences and scream, as did those thugs who tried to break the door down an hour ago. These people operated with surgical precision. Dreya stood opposite him, by the window. In her hands, the sword of the House of the Blood Moon seemed an extension of her body. She wasn't breathing. Kaiden didn't hear a single inhale. It was a technique taught only to the guards of the highest orc clans, slowing the heart rate to the point where you become part of the silence.
3 of them,
she whispered, barely audibly. Her lips barely moved.
from the direction of the woodshed. 2 on the porch. The one on the left has a crossbow. Be careful.
Kaiden nodded. He didn't ask how she knew this. He simply believed her. The trust that had grown over these weeks had now become his only compass. He adjusted his grip on the hilt of his blade. The steel was cold, but a strange warmth radiated from it. The same warmth he felt in the forge when the metal reached the right condition. It was a strange, almost mystical feeling. He wasn't just holding a weapon. He felt its structure, its density, its potential. The door shuddered, not from a battering ram strike, but from a precise, filigree tampering with the lock. The wood cracked, and the bolt he had forged himself from hardened steel flew out along with a chunk of the doorframe. Shadows burst into the house. They moved so fast that Kaiden barely had time to react. The first strike came blindly, but Kaiden, obeying an instinct he had suppressed in himself for years, simply stepped off the line of attack. He didn't fence, he worked, the way a blacksmith works with metal. The movement must be economical, nothing superfluous. A short swing, calculation of the force vector, and his blade entered the attacker's shoulder, tearing skin and breaking the collarbone. The man in black let out a hoarse cry, but didn't fall. The second attacker had already lunged at him from behind. Kaiden felt someone's hand grab his collar, but immediately someone else's hand, massive, strong, smashed the attacker into the wall with such force that a tremor went through the house. It was Dreya. She didn't fence. She just crushed. Her sword traced arcs that were impossible to dodge, and when the distance closed, she used elbows, knees, the sheer mass of her body. She became a tornado of steel and fury. The house grew cramped. The clash of metal against metal merged into a single roar. Kaiden knocked the crossbow out of the hands of an enemy trying to aim at Dreya, and with a short strike of the pommel to the temple, sent him into a knockout. Now there were 2 of them. One with a pierced shoulder, and the second, the largest, whose face was hidden by a mask. "Where is the girl?" he growled. His voice was distorted by magic. "Where is the heir of the consortium?" Kaiden froze. Heir of the consortium? He didn't understand what he was talking about, but that name, the consortium, echoed in his memory. He had heard it in tales, in rumors, in the whispers of passing merchants who were afraid to speak the word loudly. "You've got the wrong address," Kaiden replied coldly, gripping his sword more comfortably. The massive enemy lunged forward. His blade was longer, heavier. He struck with a force that would easily cleave an oak tabletop. Kaiden retreated, guiding the enemy to where the floor was uneven. He knew every centimeter of his house. He knew where the floorboards sagged, where a nail stuck out of the floor. He took a step, intentionally stepping on the edge of a board, and the enemy, expecting him to stumble, delivered the finishing blow. But Kaiden didn't stumble. He merely shifted to the side. The enemy missed, his blade sinking into the tabletop, and for a split second his arm was blocked. That split second was enough. Dreya leaped from the cupboard. Kaiden hadn't even noticed how she got up there, and her sword passed a millimeter from the opponent's throat, forcing him to recoil. "Kaiden, now!" she shouted. He struck. It wasn't the blow of a warrior wanting to kill. It was the blow of a master who knows where the vulnerable point in the structure of the metal lies. He hit exactly on the crossguard of the enemy's sword, transferring the entire force of his body into this short thrust. The enemy's sword flew from his hand, struck a ceiling beam, and fell into the hearth with a clatter. Silence fell instantly. The heavy breathing of the attackers, the scrape of their boots on the floor, and the quiet sound of cooling steel. The massive enemy retreated to the door, his eyes visible through the slits of the mask, full not of fear, but of icy calculation. "You don't know who you're protecting, Rivers," he said, wiping blood from his lips. "You think you bought an orc? You bought your death. We will return, and next time, not even a splinter will be left here." "Leave," said Dreya. She stood in the middle of the room, covered in soot, her sword pointing to the floor. "Tell your master, if he sends his dogs again, I will come for him personally. And I won't use steel. I will use what he took from me." The attackers vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared. Kaiden slammed the door, wedged a piece of timber under it, and pressed his forehead against the cold wood. His heart was pounding somewhere in his throat. He looked at Dreya. She was breathing heavily, her shoulders heaving. "Heir of the consortium?" he asked, not turning around. She walked to the table, found the pitcher of water, and took a gulp, not caring that the water ran down her chin onto the floor. "It's the name of an organization," she said, wiping her lips. "I didn't want you to know. At least, not like this." "Who are you, Dreya?" He slowly turned. There was no anger in his voice. There was only a desperate desire to understand exactly what kind of nightmare he found himself in. She slowly lowered her sword. "I am the one who escaped the golden cage they locked me in. I am not an orc from the market, Kaiden. I was raised in the house of Valkyr. My father was the architect of the system that maintains the balance in the trade routes of the entire northern continent. When he died, they tried to make me their puppet. They wanted me to manage all the financial flows using my knowledge. I refused. I ran away." Kaiden sank into a chair. "Financial flows? You? You are the one merchants sing legends about, the one who can stop a war with a stroke of a pen." "I can," she answered, looking him straight in the eyes. "But I never wanted power. I just wanted to live. I wanted to work with metal, wanted to feel life, not numbers on paper. That's why I erased my name. That's why I ended up on the market. I thought if I looked like a simple slave, they wouldn't look for me among the dregs." "And you chose my market, my path. Why me?" "Because I saw your signature." She walked up to him and touched his hands, the very ones that had just held the sword. "You are not a blacksmith, Kaiden. You are a left-hander who masterfully wields his right hand. You use tools as if they are an extension of your blade. You are the one they have been searching for all these years." Kaiden looked at his hands. "What are you talking about?" "Your father. You said you didn't know who he was, but the swords you pulled out, they belong to a lineage that was wiped off the face of the earth 20 years ago. A lineage that protected the consortium." "This is madness," Kaiden whispered. "This is our life," she said. "Now that they've found us, we have two paths. We can keep running, or we can strike first. They do not expect the farmer and the orc to go on the offensive." Kaiden looked at her. There was no doubt in her eyes. There was only resolve. He stood up. In his chest, where there used to be emptiness and a desire for silence, a fire now burned. He understood why he had bought her. This wasn't mere chance. This was destiny, woven from steel, blood, and ancient secrets that were finally beginning to unfold. "Where do we start?" he asked, placing his hand on hers. She smiled, that very smile that was worth more to him than all the gold in the world. "We start by fixing the bolt," she replied. "And then we make a list of everyone who wants to kill us. And believe me, Kaiden, they will regret it."
they took up their tools.
Work boiled. They weren't afraid of the darkness or the enemies or what tomorrow would bring. That night, they became something more than just a couple living on a farm. They became a force. And this world was not ready for what would happen when a blacksmith and his orc woman decided they had had enough. The house grew quiet, but it was the calm before the storm. Before the storm that was meant to wash away all old debts and erect something entirely new in their place. Kaiden looked at the fire in the stove. He was no longer alone, and perhaps that was the most important discovery of his entire life. The days after the attack merged into one endless process of preparation. The house ceased to be just a house. Now it was a fortress where every corner, every floorboard, and every tool had its military function. Kaiden no longer hid behind his past. He began actively invoking it. He spent hours in the forge working with those ancient swords, which turned out to be not just steel, but complex mechanisms reacting to the heat of human hands. Dreya did what she did best: strategy. She laid out maps of trade routes on the table, which, as it turned out, were tattooed on the inside of her travel bag, in the form of the finest lines visible only under a certain angle of light. Kaiden watched her for hours, marveling at how this slave from the market effortlessly calculated logistical chains that would have baffled any general. "We won't hit them head-on," she said, pointing to a spot in the mountains where Morgan's main caravan route passed. "Their strength is in numbers. Ours is in knowing exactly how they feed this machine." She taught him how to read financial trails. It turned out that every mercenary, every squad sent after their heads, was tied to a specific credit account in the consortium's banks. Kaiden was stunned. All this time he had lived in a world where the only currency was firewood and salt, while above his head spun a massive, ruthless financial empire whose threads stretched right to the threshold of his shack. "You want to ruin them?" he asked, watching her sketch an interception plan. "I want them to realize the game is no longer profitable," she replied. Her eyes glowed with a cold, calculating brilliance. "Morgan's men don't fight for an idea. They fight for a salary. If we cut off the source, their army will vanish into thin air." Their daily routine changed. Now they worked together not only in the forge, but also at the table, hunched over maps until dawn. It was an intimacy of a different kind, the closeness of two minds that found each other in a world where they were considered either nothing or a tool. Kaiden caught himself seeking her approval in every detail, in how he sharpened a blade, in how he planned the perimeter defense. One night, when silence reigned in the house, and another pre-spring wind howled outside the window, she stopped, setting her quill down. "Kaiden, have you ever thought about what would have happened if I hadn't appeared at that market?" He looked up from the trap blueprint. "I would have kept living the way I was, alone, in silence, without fear for tomorrow. But," he hesitated, "that life would have been empty. I didn't know that until I saw how you rearranged this house." She walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. Her fingers were strong, warm, with calluses from work that he now considered the most beautiful things in the world. "We were both empty," she said. "We were waiting for someone to fill that emptiness, and it seems we found more than just enemies." In that moment, Kaiden realized the word bought no longer existed. He didn't buy her, he met her. He was bought from loneliness, and she was bought from oblivion. And the price of 20 coins was the most ridiculous investment in the history of this world. The next morning, an answer came from Elias. The boy, having recovered from his wounds, became their only liaison in the city. He brought news. Morgan's caravan with gold to pay the mercenaries would set out in 3 days. This was their chance. They had 3 days to prepare a trap that would forever change the balance of power in this valley. Kaiden began to forge. He worked 3 days and 3 nights without sleep. He created not swords, but devices meant to collapse the bridge over the gorge at the right moment. Dreya handled the preparation of gear. She reworked her clothing into light combat armor, using leather and steel plates they had hardened together. She looked like a queen returned to her throne, even if this throne was in the mountains, and the queen had been declared an outlaw. On D-Day, they headed out long before dawn. The mountains were silent. Kaiden felt like a part of these mountains, ancient, indestructible, ready to strike. Dreya walked beside him. Her presence felt like a powerful surge of energy. They took a position on the ridge above the gorge. When the first lights of the caravan appeared below, Kaiden felt a strange calm. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. There was no fear there. There was pride. Pride that they were here together, on the edge of the abyss, ready to change the rules of the game. "I was born ready," she said. "Kaiden, if we don't return, know this. It was the best time of my life." "We will come back," he replied, tightly squeezing her hand. "We still need to finish the 16th tower on your model, remember?" She laughed, short, genuine, and the sound cut through the cold mountain air better than any battle cry. "I remember," she said. 16 is optimal." They prepared. The caravan was entering the kill zone. In Kaiden's hands was the trap's trigger mechanism. In Dreya's hands, her blade. The world held its breath. In that moment, standing on the edge of the abyss, he realized one simple thing. Even if the consortium, the Morgans, and the rest of the world crashed down on them right now, they would lose. Because they didn't understand the main thing. They fought for money and power, but these two fought for the right to be themselves, for the right to this home, for the right to their we. Kaiden pulled the lever. The roar with which the bridge collapsed sounded like the voice of the mountain itself, having lost its patience. "Now!" he shouted. They leapt down, straight into the chaos they had created. It wasn't a battle. It was a symphony, in which every strike was a note and every movement was rhythm. That night, not a single one of Morgan's men remained in the gorge. But most importantly, that night, a legend was born in the valley. The legend of the blacksmith who forged his own happiness, and his orc woman who needed no one's approval to be a queen. When they returned home at dawn, the house greeted them with warmth. The coals in the hearth were still smoldering. Kaiden walked to the table, poured water, and looked at Dreya. She was removing her armor, her skin covered in dust, but she looked radiant. "We won," he said. "We've only just begun," she replied, walking up to him and hugging him so tightly it caught his breath. "Now they know who we are, and they know that this house is no longer their target. It is their fear." Kaiden hugged her back. He felt the exhaustion slip away, leaving room for something far stronger. "What are we going to do tomorrow?" he asked, burying his face in her hair, which smelled of iron and mountain herbs. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will live. And the day after tomorrow, we'll start building something that will stand for centuries." He laughed. "Tomorrow.
How strange it was to think about tomorrow without fear.
He looked at the bookshelf, at the repaired roof, at the bolt he had forged with his own hands. It was his home, and now it was their home. And he knew, no matter what happened next, they would handle it. Because now they were not just two loners. They were a team. And that was the most powerful weapon in the world. The silence in the valley was no longer the same. It became electrified. After Morgan's caravan was destroyed in the gorge, the valley ceased to be a God-forsaken place on the map. Now it was the epicenter of a tectonic shift in the continent's politics. Elias brought news every day. Lords who had paid tribute to the consortium for years began to slowly pull back, watching one of the pillars of this empire crumble. But for Kaiden and Dreya, it meant only one thing. The lull was temporary. They turned the house into a veritable fortress. Kaiden retooled the forge so it could withstand a siege, and Dreya devised a system of signal markers covering every approach to their hideout. But the main change wasn't the defense. It was their internal state. They had ceased to be buyer and bought. They had become partners. One evening, when food supplies were running low, Kaiden retrieved an old casket from a hidden drawer which he had found in the basement along with the swords. It was made of rare black wood and covered in strange symbols that, as he now understood, were not merely decoration, but a key. "I can't open it," he said, sliding the casket over to Dreya. "But I feel that inside is the answer to why I am being hunted, even after 7 years of silence." Dreya looked at the symbols. Her eyes narrowed. "These aren't just symbols, Kaiden. It's a map. Or rather, an asset registry. Your father wasn't just a protector of the consortium. He was its keeper. The one who held the keys to all the secret bank accounts upon which the Empire's power was built. If this casket opens, you will become the most dangerous man on this continent. Richer than kings, more influential than any army." Kaiden fell silent. He had wanted nothing his whole life but to forge iron, and instead he found himself at the center of a global game. "I don't want this wealth, Dreya. I want them to leave us in peace." "The world doesn't leave those in peace who hold the answers to its questions," she replied, tracing the wood with her fingers. "If we don't open it, they will come anyway. Only now they will search for it blindly, plowing up the entire valley. If we open it, we get to decide who gets the answers." She chanted an incantation, a quiet, guttural spell in a language Kaiden had never heard, but which echoed in his blood like some deep resonance. The lid shuddered. A chill ran through the room, and then the casket opened with a soft click. There was no gold inside. There was a scroll, sealed with the sigil Kaiden had seen on his swords, and a small metal disc. He picked up the disc, and in that instant his vision changed. He saw the valley, saw his house, but a ghostly grid overlaid them. Lines, currents of energy, secret pathways that were hidden from ordinary eyes. "This is true sight," he whispered, looking at Dreya. "I see where the warehouses are hidden. I see where their roots run. I see everything." Dreya held her breath. "Do you understand now, Kaiden? You're not the heir to the consortium. You are the one who can dismantle it. Your father didn't leave you an inheritance. He left you the tool to destroy the system that killed your mother." Kaiden looked at his hands. They were shaking. For 7 years he had considered himself a failure who ran away from life. For 7 years he had mourned his fate, not realizing that his silence and his isolation were a form of defense he had constructed himself, without even knowing it. Did they know I was here? He asked, referring to those who came in the night. They suspected, but they had no proof. You were clean for 7 years, but now that we've destroyed their caravan, they know the farmer found what he was looking for. Tomorrow morning, it won't be 20 mercenaries here. It will be an army. They looked at each other. There was no fear in Dra's eyes, only calculation. So, we have 1 night. 1 night to prepare. We won't just sit and wait for them. We will meet them in a way they never expected. They worked through the night. Kaiden melted down their remaining metal reserves, creating traps that triggered not by force, but by magical resonance. He now felt how to do this. Dra prepared supplies, gathering everything they might need in case of a siege. They moved in sync, without words, understanding each other's intentions from a single shift of a shoulder, a single glance. Toward morning, as the sky began to lighten, they sat down on the porch to catch their breath. Kaiden took her hand. It was cold, but her grip was firm. "We will finish the 16th tower," he said, looking at the empty valley. "And we'll build 100 more like it, so this world never forgets who the true master here is." "You've become very ambitious for a blacksmith," she smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "I've become very confident for someone who found his true match," he replied. In the distance, a muffled rumble could be heard. The army was moving. They weren't taking the road, they were breaking trees, moving in a straight line, not bothering to hide. This was the end of their isolation. This was the end of the farmer's life. But for Kaiden, it was the beginning of something monumental. He stood up, adjusted his sword belt, and looked at his house. It was small, it was crooked, it was imperfect. But it was his home. And he was ready to defend it to the last drop of blood. "Are you ready, Dra?" he asked. She stood up after him, squared her shoulders, and looked at the approaching horde. Her eyes shone with amber fire. "With you?" she asked. "Kaiden, I'm ready to march into hell." They entered the house and closed the door, but this time they didn't close it out of fear. They closed it to begin their own war. And if anyone thought they could just come and take what belonged to them, they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. For they did not yet know the true fury of a blacksmith defending his hearth, and an orc woman who had finally found a home worth fighting for. Morgan's army approached the valley when the fog still lay in thick white sheets upon the grass. These weren't mere mercenaries. Kaiden saw their banners, black cloth embroidered with silver symbols of the all-seeing eye. This was an elite squad, the shadows of the consortium. Professionals whose job was not conquering lands, but purging witnesses. There were about 100 of them, heavy cavalry, crossbowmen with repeating bows capable of piercing steel plating, and magical inquisitors whose staves flickered with an unsettling violet light. Kaiden stood on the porch, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't trembling. He felt the metallic grid laid over the world through the disk vibrating in his pocket. He saw their vulnerable points, sparks of energy fueling their armor. "They don't know what we know," Dra whispered, standing behind him. She drew her bow, its bowstring woven from the sinews of a mountain dragon, the only material capable of withstanding the force she could put into a shot. "To them, we are just a target." "Let them try to reach us," Kaiden replied. The first volley of crossbow bolts struck the house, but they didn't even flinch. Kaiden had pre-reinforced the walls with layers of hardened steel and crossbeams soaked in a special compound from the forge. The bolts bounced off harmlessly,
throwing sparks. "Now!" Dreya commanded. Kaiden pulled the lever hidden under the porch steps. The entire courtyard in front of the house turned into a fiery trap.
He had laid a network of combustible oils under the top layer of soil, which he had been boiling down for 3 days. The ground erupted, turning into a strip of pure flame, cutting the enemies off from the house. "Forward!" Kaiden shouted, drawing both blades. They rushed out, but it wasn't suicide. They knew every meter of this land. Dreya moved faster than the wind. Her arrows found their targets with an accuracy bordering on sorcery. Every shot of hers was aimed at the mages. She knew that as soon as their barriers fell, the rest of the army would turn into mere meat. Kaiden threw himself into the thick of it. His movements were devoid of panic. He was not just a warrior, he was the architect of this battle. He used his swords like levers, knocking horses off their feet, breaking formations, forcing opponents into close combat where their numerical advantage was nullified by the cramped space. He was a blacksmith, and this battle was his anvil. "Left flank!" Dreya shouted, covering him from a crossbowman. Kaiden spun around, lunged, and his blade, vibrating with the energy of the disc, pierced the enemy's armor like paper. He felt the energy flowing from the casket into his muscles. He no longer felt tired. He was part of the valley itself. But then, the one they feared most emerged from the enemy ranks. Morgan's chief inquisitor. Tall, gaunt, in a robe that seemed to absorb the light around it. He raised his staff, and the air began to thicken. "Did you think you could hide in this hole?" The Inquisitor's voice echoed directly in their heads, causing nausea. "The Consortium owns not just money, it owns space itself. Kaiden Rivers, you are merely an error in our ledgers. An error I will now correct." The Inquisitor struck his staff against the ground. The shockwave knocked even the horses off their feet. Kaiden felt his swords grow heavy, as if a ton of lead had been dumped on them. Dreya cried out as an invisible force pinned her to the ground. "Dreya!" Kaiden tried to take a step, but his feet felt rooted to the soil. "She dies first," the Inquisitor stated coldly. "And then we will rip everything you hid right out of you." Kaiden watched as Dreya tried to rise, her hands, accustomed to the forge, clawing at the frozen earth. The fury that had been building up in him all these years, fury for a lost childhood, for his parents' deaths, for 7 years of loneliness, finally found an outlet. It didn't just boil, it transformed into pure energy. He looked at the disc in his pocket. His father hadn't left it to him to hide. He left it so Kaiden could use the full power of the Consortium against itself. "You're right," Kaiden said, his voice dropping low with vibrating metallic undertones. "You own space, but I own what creates this space." He squeezed the disc in his hand so tightly it bit into his palm. He closed his eyes and visualized every node, every connection, every financial flow that powered this man's staff. He didn't attack the mage. He attacked the source of his magic. "Shutting down," he whispered. A sound like a cracking glacier echoed. The Inquisitor screamed. His staff, burning with violet light, began to dim and then crumbled to dust. The magic holding Kaiden and Dreya dissipated like smoke. The Inquisitor staggered back, his masked face expressing pure terror. He didn't understand what had happened. His power, his source of strength, simply vanished, as if they had never existed. "My turn," Kaiden said. He surged forward with such speed that the Inquisitor didn't even have time to throw up his hands. One strike, and the enemy's mask shattered. Beneath it was an ordinary, terrified human face,
completely at odds with the legends of his might. "You are nothing without them," Kaiden said, pressing the blade to the mage's throat. "Tell them the consortium no longer pays its bills." The Inquisitor trembled. "They'll kill you. They'll kill us all." "Let them try," Kaiden replied.
He didn't kill him. He just shoved him aside, back toward his men. "Get out, and tell Morgan. The next trap won't leave even ashes of him." Morgan's army, stripped of its leader and magic, began to retreat. They fled in panic, abandoning weapons and banners. They realized the one standing in this valley was not merely a man. He was a force they could not calculate. Kaiden stood in the middle of the battlefield, breathing heavily. It was quiet all around. Snow, stained in dark colors, began to cover the traces of the battle. Dreya walked up to him. Her hands were bloody, her face covered in soot, but her eyes, they glowed with a triumph you couldn't buy for any money. "You did it," she said. "You just turned him off." "I didn't just turn him off," he replied, sheathing his sword. "I understand how they work. Now that I see all their connections, I can bring down their entire system in one day." She embraced him, and this time it wasn't just an embrace. It was the acknowledgement of two equals. "So, we go on the offensive?" she asked. Kaiden looked at his house, which had withstood the storm. He looked to the east, toward Morgan's trade routes, which now lay before him in plain sight, visible to his new vision. "We're going to forge a new history," he replied. "We're going to need a lot of steel. And I think we're going to have a lot of orders." They turned and walked home. It had been a long night, the longest night of their lives. But the dawn breaking now was the first dawn of their new, true life. A life where they chose who they were. A life where the blacksmith and his orc woman were not just a couple, but the architects of the future of this continent. 3 months passed. The valley had changed beyond recognition. It was no longer a god-forsaken place. Now it was a nexus upon which the fates of trade houses, guilds, and even minor kingdoms depended. Kaiden's shack had transformed into something between an estate and an impregnable citadel. Though from the outside it still looked like the modest home of a hard-working farmer. That was their main defense. No one looked for an empire where cabbages grew in the garden and perfectly ordinary smoke rose from the chimney. Kaiden sat in the forge, working on an order for a new trade guild that he and Dreya had helped establish on the ruins of Morgan's influence. He wasn't just forging, he was engineering. Using the knowledge gleaned from the asset casket, he created security locks that were impossible to pick, and parts for mechanisms the world didn't even know existed. Dreya entered the workshop without knocking. She brought him water, as she did every morning. She no longer wore tattered travel clothes, but a strict, functional outfit of dark leather that didn't restrict movement, yet looked like the uniform of someone wielding real power. She was no longer the orc from the market. She was the architect, the one who directed Kaiden's resources into the right channels. "The southern trade corridor is entirely ours," she said, setting the mug on the edge of the anvil. "Morgan is trying to negotiate, but I've set terms he won't be able to accept. He will either go bankrupt or leave this sector forever." Kaiden set down his hammer and wiped his hands. "He'll choose the latter. He's no fighter, he's a dealer, and dealers know when their capital stops yielding a profit." They walked out onto the porch. The day was warm. Spring had finally come into its own. The valley was green, and the scent of new life was everywhere. Off to the side, near the shed, a little girl was playing, the daughter of one of their new allies whom they had taken into their care while her parents established supply lines. Dreya, or, as she was nicknamed in the valley, Little Strategist,
was building her own block fort out of stones, seriously discussing the geometry of angles with Dreya.
Kaiden watched them, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling washed through his chest. It wasn't the calm he had valued so highly before. It was satisfaction. The deep, creative satisfaction of a man who had built something that wouldn't fall apart at the first gust of wind.
"We built this," Dreya said quietly, walking up and standing beside him. "We built this," he agreed. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. She leaned against him with her entire, strong, reliable body. "Sometimes I remember that day at the market," he confessed. "And that piece of fur for the bed. It feels like it was in another life." "It was another life," she replied. "That life belonged to people who didn't deserve us. But this one belongs to us. You became something greater than just a blacksmith, Kaiden." "And you became something greater than just an orc," he added. "You became the one who rewrote the rules of this world." A rider appeared on the horizon, Elias. He didn't just deliver the mail anymore. He was their eyes in the human world. He slowed down at the gates, dismounted, and waved to them. There was no more anxiety in his eyes, only respect. He knew whose side the power was on, and he was proud to be part of this alliance. "News from the capital?" Kaiden shouted. "Silence," Elias replied, stepping closer. "Everyone has frozen. They are waiting to see what you do next. They are afraid." Kaiden looked at Dreya. She gave a barely noticeable nod. "Let them fear," he said. "We have work to do, and this work does not involve conquests. It involves order." In the evening, when the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the snowcaps in shades of rose gold, they sat in their favorite spot, on 2 logs in front of the house. Dreya took out that very same disc that had once granted him the sight. She turned it over in her fingers. "We can use this for anything," she said. "We can build a city here.
We can rule this entire space." Kaiden took the disc and hid it back in the casket. "We don't need a city, Dreya. We need a home. Cities are for those who want power, and we have already found what we were looking for."
"And what were we searching for?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. He thought about the 7 years of silence, about dead friends, about swords waiting for their hour, and about the orc woman whose strength was not a threat to him, but a pillar of support. "We were looking for a place where we could be ourselves," he said, "where we wouldn't have to hide, where we could just work, build, and know that when we return home, someone will be waiting for us. And it doesn't matter if we were bought for 20 coins or an entire empire. What matters is that we are here, and we are together." She smiled. It was that very smile for which he was ready to turn the world upside down a dozen more times. "You know, Kaiden, I always dreamed of having a garden. Not just a vegetable patch, but a garden where you can just watch things grow and not worry about having to defend it from raids." "Then we will plant a garden," he replied. "The biggest garden in this valley, and I will build a fence that won't let a single shadow through." They sat looking at the stars, which, in the mountains, seemed so close you could almost reach out and touch them. In this house, in this place, amidst this harsh but beautiful world, they had finally found what neither the gold of the consortium nor the power of barbarian clans could give them. They found peace. But it was the peace of strong people who knew If the world challenged them again, they would be ready. But today they were just enjoying the sound of the wind in the leaves, the breath of the house, and the way their hearts beat in unison. And somewhere in the forest, at the very edge of their domain, an old gray wolf sat and looked at the light in their windows. He saw them.
He knew that these two were no longer just random passers-by in this world. They had become its architects. And perhaps that was why he never set foot on their land again. He respected power. And in this house, in this quiet valley, there was more power than in any of Morgan's castles. The end of the journey? No. This was only the beginning. And Kaiden Rivers, the blacksmith who had once wanted only silence, knew. His life was no longer just survival. It was a forge in which he would hammer out his happiness every single day. The strike of the hammer rang out from the workshop, and that sound was the most beautiful soundtrack to their new, endless life. And if anyone anywhere in the world thought they could come and shatter their peace, well, let them try. The anvil was waiting, and the blacksmith was very, very angry at those who interrupted his work.